On the morning of June 16, 1950, at approximately 7:45 a.m., FBI Special Agent John Harrington and his partner, Agent Robert Lamphere, knocked on the door of a modest two-bedroom apartment in a building on Rivington Street on Manhattan's Lower East Side. The building was a five-story walk-up constructed in 1912, its brick facade darkened by decades of coal smoke and urban grime. The apartment they sought was on the fourth floor, accessible only by a narrow staircase that creaked with each step. Inside the apartment lived David Greenglass, a 28-year-old machinist, his wife Ruth, age 26, and their young son, Stephen, age 4. When Ruth Greenglass opened the door that morning, she was wearing a cotton house dress and slippers, her hair was pinned back, and Stephen played with toy cars on the living room floor behind her. The agents identified themselves and informed David that he was under arrest for conspiracy to commit espionage. Ruth's expression, according to Harrington's later report, shifted immediately from confusion to what appeared to be terror. David emerged from the bedroom still fastening his belt, having just gotten dressed for his shift at the Pitt Machine Products Company in Queens, where he had worked since his discharge from the Army in 1946. David Greenglass was a short man, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, with dark hair and brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had a slight build, weighing perhaps 140 pounds, and had the permanently oil-stained hands of someone who worked with machinery every day. When the agents informed him he was under arrest, his first words, according to the arrest report, were that he wanted to speak to an attorney. According to neighbors who later spoke with investigators, Ruth Greenglass could be heard crying after the agents departed with her husband in custody. Stephen, too young to understand what was happening, asked repeatedly when his father would come home. Before we continue with David Greenglass's story and the devastating chain of events that would destroy multiple families, if you're fascinated by the hidden human stories behind Cold War espionage operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you these documented cases every week, examining the real people behind history's most consequential secrets. Now, let's go back to David's early life and understand how an ordinary machinist from the Lower East Side became involved in atomic espionage. David Greenglass had been born on March 2, 1922, in Manhattan, the youngest of 5 children born to Barnett and Tessie Greenglass, Jewish immigrants from the Austro-Hungarian Empire who had arrived in New York in 1908. The family lived in a cramped tenement apartment on Sheriff Street on the Lower East Side, a neighborhood populated almost entirely by working-class Jewish immigrants and their children. Barnett worked as a presser in the garment industry for wages that barely supported the family. David's sister, Ethel, born in 1915, became involved in labor organizing and left-wing politics as a teenager. In 1936, when David was 14 years old, Ethel married Julius Rosenberg, an engineering student at City College of New York who was an active member of the Young Communist League. David himself was not an exceptional student. He attended public schools in Manhattan and showed aptitude for mechanical work rather than academic subjects. After graduating from Harran High School in 1940, he found work in a machine shop, learning the trade that would define his adult life. In 1942, David met Ruth Prince, a young woman from the Bronx whose family background was similar to his own. They were married on November 29, 1942, when David was 20 years old and Ruth was 18. 4 months later, in March 1943, David was drafted into the United States Army. The Army assigned David to the Special Engineer Detachment and sent him to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where he worked in machine shops supporting weapons testing programs. In July 1944, David received orders transferring him to a classified military installation designated only as Site Y in New Mexico. He traveled by train to Lamy, New Mexico, then by military transport to Los Alamos, a cluster of temporary buildings and laboratories on a mesa approximately 35 miles northwest of Santa Fe. Los Alamos was the central laboratory of the Manhattan Project, the Allied program to develop atomic weapons. The installation housed thousands of military personnel, scientists, engineers, and support staff working under conditions of extraordinary secrecy. Security was pervasive. Movement on and off the mesa was strictly controlled. Mail was censored. Telephone calls were monitored. The entire installation was surrounded by fences and guard posts, and military police patrolled constantly. David Greenglass was assigned to the machine shop serving the laboratory's experimental programs. His supervisor was a civilian machinist named Roy Scherer, who managed a team of approximately 20 men working in shifts to produce components for the scientists' experiments. The work required extreme precision, with tolerances often measured in thousandths of an inch. David machined parts from beryllium, uranium, and other materials that required special handling procedures. David did not initially understand the purpose of the components he was making. The scientists who designed the experiments did not explain the theoretical principles to the machinists. However, David began inferring from the components he made and from conversations he overheard that Los Alamos was developing some kind of extraordinarily powerful explosive device. By late 1944, he had concluded that the project involved atomic energy, though he did not understand the physics involved. In November 1944, Ruth Greenglass traveled to New Mexico to be near her husband. She found a small rented room in Albuquerque, approximately 90 miles south of Los Alamos, and David was granted weekend passes to visit her when his work schedule permitted. During one of these visits in late November 1944, Ruth informed David that Julius Rosenberg had asked her to deliver a message. According to Ruth's later testimony, Julius had told her that he was involved in collecting information for the Soviet Union and that he believed David, given his assignment to Los Alamos, might have access to valuable information about the atomic bomb program. Julius had asked Ruth to determine whether David would be willing to provide such information. David's reaction, according to his own later accounts, was initially hesitant. He was not a committed communist and had never been a member of the Communist Party. His political views were generally progressive, but these were common positions among working-class New Yorkers of his generation and did not constitute ideological commitment to Soviet communism. However, several factors influenced David's decision. First, the Soviet Union in late 1944 was a wartime ally of the United States, fighting and dying in enormous numbers to defeat Nazi Germany. The idea of sharing information with an ally seemed less like betrayal and more like contributing to the common cause against fascism. Second, David admired Julius and trusted his judgment. Third, David enjoyed the idea of being important, of having valuable knowledge. The opportunity to contribute information that Julius characterized as significant appealed to David's desire to matter. According to Ruth's testimony, David agreed. He told Ruth he would provide whatever information he could about the work being done at Los Alamos. The mechanics of the information transfer were established through a recognition signal that would become infamous in the annals of Cold War espionage. Ruth received instructions to expect a contact from Soviet intelligence. The contact would identify himself using a recognition signal. He would have one half of a Jell-O box top that had been cut with a distinctive irregular pattern, and Ruth would have the matching half. This type of recognition signal was standard Soviet intelligence tradecraft designed to authenticate couriers in situations where neither party knew what the other looked like. The irregular cut made forgery nearly impossible, and the mundane object, a Jell-O box, would attract no attention if discovered. In early June 1945, Ruth was in Albuquerque when a man knocked on the door of her rented room. He was approximately 40 years old, of medium height, with dark hair and an unremarkable appearance. He introduced himself as Dave from Pittsburgh and produced half of a Jell-O box top. Ruth matched it with her half. The pieces fit together perfectly. The man, whose real name was Harry Gold, explained that he was there to receive any information David could provide about the atomic bomb program. Ruth told him that David would be visiting from Los Alamos that weekend and arranged a meeting. On June 3, 1945, David Greenglass met Harry Gold in Ruth's rented room in Albuquerque. David had brought with him several items he believed would be valuable to Soviet intelligence. First, he had written descriptions of the general layout of Los Alamos, identifying which buildings housed which types of research. Second, and far more significant, David had prepared rough sketches of a component he had been asked to machine. A lens mold designed to shape high explosives for what he understood to be an implosion-type atomic weapon. The lens molds were critical components in the implosion design being developed at Los Alamos. Unlike the simpler gun-type design used in the Hiroshima bomb, the implosion weapon required conventional explosives to compress a sphere of plutonium with extraordinary precision and simultaneity. The explosives had to be shaped using specially designed molds called lens molds. That would focus the blast wave inward uniformly from all directions. David's sketches showed the physical dimensions and configuration of these molds, revealing important details about the weapon's design. While David did not comprehend the complex physics involved, his technical drawings provided Soviet scientists with confirmation that the American program was pursuing an implosion design and offered specific details about the mechanical implementation. Harry Gold reviewed the materials David provided, asked several clarifying questions about dimensions and specifications, and gave David an envelope containing $500 in cash. The money was both compensation for David's risk and support for Ruth. David accepted the money without apparent hesitation, according to both his and Ruth's later testimony. The meeting lasted approximately 30 minutes. Gold departed first, and David returned to Los Alamos later that evening. What David did not know was that Harry Gold was one of the most active Soviet intelligence couriers operating in the United States during World War II. Gold had been involved in Soviet espionage since the early 1930s and had handled numerous sources across various industries. On the same trip to New Mexico in June 1945, Gold also met with Klaus Fuchs, a British physicist working at Los Alamos who had far more comprehensive access to the theoretical physics and weapons design data than David ever did. Fuchs, a committed communist, provided the Soviets with detailed information about plutonium metallurgy, implosion calculations, and weapons efficiency estimates. Compared to Fuchs's contributions, David Greenglass's information was relatively minor, offering confirmation and mechanical details rather than breakthrough scientific insights. Over the following months, David continued to provide information to Julius Rosenberg during visits to New York after his discharge from the Army in February 1946. During meetings in late 1945 and early 1946 held at the Rosenberg apartment on the Lower East Side, David provided Julius with additional sketches and descriptions based on what he had observed and memorized from technical drawings at Los Alamos. Julius gave David additional cash payments, typically $200 to $500 per meeting. By mid-1946, David had returned to civilian life and was attempting to build a normal middle-class existence. He and Ruth had their son Stephen in March 1946. Julius provided financial backing to help David establish a small machine shop business. To all outward appearances, David was an ordinary veteran rebuilding his life after military service. What David did not know was that Soviet intelligence operations in the United States were already under investigation. The investigation had begun in 1943, when American cryptographers working for the Army's Signal Intelligence Service began attempting to decrypt Soviet intelligence communications. This effort, codenamed Venona, involved the painstaking analysis of thousands of encrypted messages sent between Soviet intelligence offices in the United States and Moscow during the 1940s. The decryption effort was extraordinarily difficult because Soviet intelligence used one-time pads, theoretically unbreakable encryption systems. However, Soviet code clerks had made critical errors during the war years, reusing portions of one-time pads and creating vulnerabilities that allowed American cryptographers to begin breaking the codes. The Venona project remained highly classified, with even President Truman not being fully briefed on its scope. The decrypts were so sensitive that FBI and military intelligence agencies could not use them directly as evidence in court without revealing that American cryptographers had broken Soviet codes. By 1948, Venona decrypts had revealed the existence of extensive Soviet intelligence operations in the United States, including networks focused on atomic espionage. The decrypts referred to sources and agents using code names rather than real names. One decrypt referenced an agent codenamed Caliber, who had a wife visiting him in New Mexico and who had access to information about the atomic bomb program. Another mentioned Caliber providing information about lens molds and implosion mechanisms. A third mentioned a courier meeting with Caliber in Albuquerque to receive documents. FBI analysts working with Venona decrypts concluded that Caliber was likely someone with machine shop experience who had been stationed at Los Alamos in 1944 to 1945 and whose wife had visited him during that period. Cross-referencing military assignment records with travel records and family information eventually led investigators to David Greenglass as the probable match for Caliber. The courier was eventually identified as Harry Gold through a combination of Venona decrypts and traditional investigative work. Gold was arrested on May 22, 1950, and after intensive interrogation lasting several days, he confessed to his role as a courier for Soviet intelligence. During these interrogations, Gold described his June 1945 meeting in Albuquerque with a soldier stationed at Los Alamos, providing details that matched David Greenglass. The arrest of Julius Rosenberg on May 23, 1950, followed directly from Gold's confession. Gold had identified Julius as one of his contacts in the Soviet espionage network. Julius was charged with conspiracy to commit espionage, but refused to cooperate with investigators, denied all allegations, and exercised his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. This was the context when FBI agents arrived at David Greenglass's door on June 16, 1950. The Bureau had Harry Gold's confession. They had Venona decrypts identifying David as Caliber. They had David's connection to Julius Rosenberg. What they needed was David's confession and his agreement to testify. David Greenglass was taken into federal custody and held without bail. The arrest was covered extensively in newspapers. For Ruth and Stephen, the arrest transformed their lives instantly. Their apartment was searched by FBI agents. Ruth was questioned extensively about her own role. Neighbors who had known the Greenglasses as an ordinary young family now regarded them with suspicion. Stephen Greenglass, who was 4 years old at the time of his father's arrest, would later say that he had no clear memories of the actual arrest, but remembered the confusion and fear that dominated their household in the weeks that followed. His mother tried to maintain normalcy, but he sensed that something terrible had happened. In the days following his arrest, David faced an impossible choice. His attorney, O. John Rugg, laid out the options with brutal clarity. If David refused to cooperate, he faced the death penalty or life imprisonment. Ruth, who had participated in the conspiracy by facilitating meetings and passing messages, could also be prosecuted. If both parents were imprisoned, Stephen would be left with no one. However, if David cooperated fully and testified truthfully, prosecutors indicated informally that Ruth would not be charged, and David might receive a sentence measured in years rather than decades. Ruth was adamant that cooperation was their only option. She was categorically opposed to fleeing the country, an option that Julius had apparently discussed with them as a contingency plan. They had a small child. They had no significant savings. Ruth spoke no Russian and had no connections outside the United States. The prospect of spending the rest of her life as a refugee in the Soviet Union seemed worse than any alternative. Ruth argued that their primary obligation was to Stephen, who needed at least one parent not in prison. Over the course of several agonizing discussions in late June 1950, Ruth convinced David that cooperation was necessary. She argued that Julius's arrest demonstrated that the network was already compromised and that remaining silent would not protect anyone. She pointed out that Harry Gold had already confessed and had provided investigators with enough information to convict David regardless of whether he cooperated. On June 17, 1950, David Greenglass was formally charged with conspiracy to commit espionage. Shortly thereafter, he agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors. His attorney negotiated an informal understanding. If David provided complete and truthful testimony about the espionage network, prosecutors would recommend a sentence significantly less severe than what he might otherwise face and would not prosecute Ruth. David's interrogations were conducted primarily by FBI Special Agent Robert Lamphere, who had been working Soviet counterintelligence cases for several years and who had deep familiarity with the Venona project. Over sessions conducted in June and July 1950, David provided detailed accounts of his espionage activities. He described the initial approach through Ruth and Julius Rosenberg in late 1944. He described his meeting with Harry Gold in Albuquerque in June 1945. He described the lens molds, the sketches, the cash payments, and subsequent meetings with Julius in New York. Critically, David also implicated his sister Ethel Rosenberg in the espionage conspiracy. According to David's testimony, Ethel had been present during a meeting in the Rosenberg apartment in September 1945 when David had provided Julius with handwritten notes about the atomic bomb program. David claimed that Ethel had typed up these handwritten notes to produce a more readable version for transmission to Soviet intelligence. This testimony about Ethel's involvement would prove to be one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Ethel Rosenberg had not been mentioned in any of the Venona decrypts. There was no independent evidence of her participation in espionage activities beyond David's testimony. Ruth Greenglass also provided testimony confirming David's account of Julius's initial approach in late 1944, her meetings with Harry Gold in Albuquerque, and various other details of the espionage operation. Prosecutors accepted that Ruth's role had been primarily as a facilitator and decided not to charge her, calculating that her testimony as a witness would be more valuable than her prosecution as a defendant. Ethel Rosenberg was arrested on August 11, 1950, approximately 2 months after David's arrest. She was charged with conspiracy to commit espionage based primarily on David's testimony about her typing his handwritten notes. Her arrest was partly strategic, Prosecutors believed that threatening Ethel with prosecution might pressure Julius to confess and to identify other members of the espionage network. Julius and Ethel had two young sons, Michael, age 7, and Robert, age 3, and prosecutors calculated that the prospect of both parents being imprisoned or executed might overcome Julius's commitment to silence. This calculation proved incorrect. Julius refused to confess or to cooperate with investigators, maintaining that he was innocent of all charges. Ethel, likewise, refused to confess or cooperate, insisting that she had no involvement in espionage and that David's testimony was false. The trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg began on March 6, 1951, in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. The presiding judge was Irving Kaufman, and the prosecution was led by Irving Sapol, the United States Attorney for the Southern District. The trial lasted approximately 3 weeks, but the most damaging testimony came from David and Ruth Greenglass. David testified over the course of several days, describing in detail his espionage activities and Julius's role in recruiting and directing him. He described the lens molds, the sketches, the money he had received. He testified that Julius had explained to him that the information was being provided to the Soviet Union to help ensure that the Soviets would have atomic weapons and would not be at a strategic disadvantage relative to the United States. He testified that Ethel had typed his handwritten notes during a meeting at the Rosenberg apartment. Ruth corroborated David's testimony, adding details about meetings and conversations. The defense attempted to impeach the Greenglasses' credibility by highlighting that Ruth had not been charged despite her admitted role in the conspiracy, arguing that this created a powerful incentive for both David and Ruth to tell prosecutors whatever they wanted to hear. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from Harry Gold, who confirmed that he had met with David Greenglass in Albuquerque and had received information about the atomic bomb program. Gold's testimony corroborated the Greenglasses' account and provided independent verification of key facts. Gold himself had been sentenced on December 9, 1950, to 30 years in federal prison for his role as a Soviet courier. He would serve 15 years before being released in 1965, and he died in 1972 at age 61. On March 29, 1951, after approximately 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts against both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Judge Kaufman scheduled sentencing for April 5, 1951. The question of what sentence to impose generated intense debate. The crime of conspiracy to commit espionage during wartime carried a maximum penalty of death. The prosecution's position was that Julius and Ethel Rosenberg had committed one of the most serious crimes imaginable by providing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had argued that the Rosenbergs' espionage had resulted in the Soviet Union obtaining atomic weapons years earlier than expected, potentially emboldening Stalin to support the North Korean invasion of South Korea in 1950. Judge Kaufman, in his sentencing statement delivered on April 5, 1951, stated that he considered the crime worse than murder. He declared that by putting the atomic bomb into Soviet hands years before American scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb, the defendants had already caused the communist aggression in Korea with resultant casualties exceeding 50,000, and that millions more innocent people might pay the price of their treason. He stated that by their betrayal they had undoubtedly altered the course of history to the disadvantage of the country. Judge Kaufman sentenced both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to death by electrocution. The sentence generated immediate controversy. Ethel's sentence struck many observers as disproportionate to her actual role in the conspiracy. The primary evidence against her was David's testimony about typing notes, suggesting a relatively minor supporting role rather than active intelligence gathering. David Greenglass was sentenced on April 6, 1951, one day after the Rosenbergs received their death sentences. Judge Kaufman, acknowledging David's cooperation with prosecutors and his testimony, sentenced David to 15 years in federal prison. Ruth Greenglass was never charged and never served time. The death sentences against Julius and Ethel triggered extensive appeals and clemency campaigns that would last more than 2 years. Defense attorneys argued that the sentences were excessive, that the evidence against Ethel was insufficient, and that the trial had been conducted in an atmosphere of Cold War hysteria. Support came from civil liberties organizations, religious groups, international observers, and left-wing political movements. Petitions were circulated, demonstrations were held, editorials argued for clemency. The Eisenhower administration, which took office in January 1953, reviewed the case and decided not to grant clemency. President Eisenhower's statement declining to commute the sentences emphasized that the Rosenbergs had betrayed their country during wartime and had shown no remorse or willingness to cooperate with authorities. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed on June 19, 1953, at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. Julius was electrocuted first, at approximately 8:04 p.m. Ethel was electrocuted second at approximately 8:15 p.m. Both maintained their innocence to the end. Their sons, Michael and Robert, became orphans, eventually being adopted by the songwriter Abel Meeropol and his wife, Anne. Michael and Robert Meeropol, as they became known, grew up believing that their parents had been innocent victims of Cold War persecution. As adults, they became activists campaigning to clear their parents' names. They filed Freedom of Information Act requests, researched government archives, and published books arguing that their parents had been wrongly convicted. The release of Venona decrypts in 1995 confirmed that Julius had indeed been a Soviet intelligence agent, though the decrypts provided no evidence of Ethel's involvement. Michael and Robert have continued to argue that while Julius may have engaged in some espionage activities, the evidence did not justify execution, and that Ethel was essentially innocent and was executed primarily to pressure Julius into confessing. David Greenglass was initially incarcerated at the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. He was a model prisoner who caused no disciplinary problems and who spent his time working in the prison machine shop. He was released on parole in 1960 after serving approximately 10 years of his 15-year sentence. Re-entering civilian life was difficult. David's conviction meant he could not work in any defense-related industry or obtain security clearances. His notoriety made finding employment challenging. He and Ruth, who had raised Stephen largely as a single parent during his imprisonment, moved to Queens and attempted to build a quiet, anonymous life. David changed his name legally to avoid recognition, though the exact name he adopted was never made public. He found work as a machinist for small manufacturing companies willing to overlook his criminal record. He lived frugally, avoided political activity of any kind, and refused all interview requests about his espionage activities or the Rosenberg case. Stephen Greenglass grew up knowing that his father had been in prison, but not initially understanding why. Ruth told him, when he was young, only that his father had made mistakes during the war and had been punished for them. As Stephen grew older and began to understand more about the Rosenberg case from news coverage and from schoolmates, Ruth provided more complete explanations. Stephen, according to interviews he gave decades later, struggled throughout his childhood and adolescence with the knowledge of what his father had done. He felt shame about his father's espionage, anger about his father's betrayal of family members, and confusion about how to reconcile the father he knew with the public figure who had helped send his own sister to the electric chair. For decades after his release, David Greenglass lived in obscurity. The Rosenberg case receded somewhat in public consciousness as other spy cases captured attention. David avoided publicity, declined interviews, and built a life centered on work, family, and staying out of the spotlight. Then, in 2001, more than 50 years after the events in question, David gave an interview to journalist Sam Roberts of the New York Times. The interview, conducted when David was 79 years old and in declining health, revealed information that shocked historians and reopened long-standing debates about the Rosenberg case. In the interview, David suggested that his testimony about Ethel Rosenberg typing his handwritten notes may have been exaggerated or false. David indicated that he and Ruth had emphasized Ethel's involvement at the suggestion of prosecutors who wanted to strengthen the case against her, and that he had tailored his testimony to protect Ruth from prosecution. According to David's account, prosecutors had made clear that if he could provide evidence of Ethel's active participation in the conspiracy, Ruth would not be charged. David, desperate to keep Ruth out of prison so that Stephen would have at least one parent at home, had agreed to testify in ways that implicated Ethel. He claimed that he had not expected this testimony to result in Ethel's execution and that he had been horrified when she was sentenced to death. David's admission was met with outrage from those who had long argued that Ethel had been executed unjustly. The revelation raised troubling questions about prosecutorial ethics and about the pressure placed on witnesses to provide testimony that would satisfy prosecutors' strategic objectives. Ruth Greenglass died on April 7, 2008, at age 84. She never publicly discussed the Rosenberg case or her role in it. David Greenglass died on July 1, 2014, at age 92. His death was not widely reported, and there was no public funeral. His obituary in the New York Times noted his role in the Rosenberg case. His espionage conviction, his testimony against his sister, and his 2001 statement suggesting he had exaggerated Ethel's role. Stephen Greenglass lived a private life, declining requests for interviews and avoiding public association with his father's notoriety. The historical judgment on David Greenglass's espionage activities remains contested. Soviet archival materials released after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 confirmed that Julius Rosenberg had indeed been an active Soviet intelligence agent who had run a network of sources. The archival materials also confirmed that David Greenglass had provided information about the atomic bomb program, and that this information had been transmitted to Soviet scientists. What remains disputed is the value of the information David provided. American scientists who have reviewed the sketches and descriptions David gave to Soviet intelligence have generally concluded that the information was not particularly sophisticated or crucial to Soviet weapons development. The Soviet Union already had access to far more valuable information from Klaus Fuchs and from their own theoretical physics research. What Soviet scientists may have gained from David's information was confirmation that certain design approaches were feasible, and some details about mechanical components. Some historians argue that David's espionage accelerated Soviet atomic weapons development by perhaps a few months to a year at most. Others argue that even marginal acceleration during a period of intense Cold War competition was enormously damaging. The question of moral responsibility in David Greenglass's case involves layers of complexity that resist simple judgment. David chose to commit espionage. He was not coerced, threatened, or blackmailed. He made a conscious decision to provide classified information to Soviet intelligence, and he continued making that decision over a period of more than a year. He accepted money for the information. which suggests that his motivations included personal gain in addition to whatever political rationale he offered himself. However, David's choices were made within a specific historical context that shaped what options seemed available and what consequences seemed likely. His belief that he was helping to prevent a future war by ensuring that the Soviet Union would not be at a strategic disadvantage was naive, but perhaps not entirely insincere. None of these people chose the situations they found themselves in. If David's 2001 statement is accurate, Ethel Rosenberg was executed based partly on testimony that was exaggerated or false. Michael and Robert Rosenberg grew up as orphans because their uncle had testified against their parents. Ruth Greenglass spent nearly a decade as a single parent and spent the rest of her life knowing that she had helped send her sister-in-law to the electric chair. Stephen Greenglass grew up with the knowledge that his father was a convicted spy and that his aunt had been executed partly because of his father's testimony. Ethel did not choose to have a brother who would become a spy and would then testify against her. Michael and Robert did not choose to have parents who would be executed. Ruth did not choose to have a husband who would involve her in an espionage conspiracy. Stephen did not choose to have a father who would commit espionage and then cooperate with prosecutors to save himself and his wife. And yet all of them lived with the consequences of David's choices for the rest of their lives. The choice David faced in the summer of 1950 offered no good options. He could have refused to cooperate with prosecutors, maintained solidarity with Julius and Ethel, and accepted a death sentence or life imprisonment. That choice would have destroyed his own life and would have left Ruth to raise Stephen alone, possibly facing prosecution herself. Or he could cooperate, provide testimony that would help convict Julius and Ethel, and receive a reduced sentence that would eventually allow him to return to his family. That choice saved Ruth from prosecution and gave Stephen at least one parent who was not in prison, but it contributed to Ethel's execution. David chose to protect his wife and child at the cost of his sister's life. That choice was simultaneously an act of family loyalty and an act of family betrayal, depending on which family members you prioritize. Both things are true simultaneously, and the fact that they are both true is what makes the Greenglass case so difficult to reduce to simple moral judgments. The Rosenberg case became a touchstone in debates about Cold War civil liberties, about the ethics of capital punishment, about the relationship between family loyalty and civic obligation, and about the human cost of ideological conflicts. For historians of Cold War espionage, the Greenglass case illustrates the methods and motivations of Soviet intelligence operations during the 1940s. For legal scholars, the case raises questions about the ethics of witness cooperation agreements and the pressure placed on defendants to provide testimony against family members. For anyone reflecting on the human dimensions of historical events, the Greenglass case serves as a reminder that espionage was not an abstract game played by nations, but a series of individual choices made by people with families, fears, ambitions, and rationalizations. David Greenglass was 22 when he became a spy. He was 92 when he died, having spent 70 years living with the consequences of decisions made during less than 2 years of his youth. The lens molds he sketched in 1945 are now historical curiosities. Obsolete technology from the early atomic age. The technical information he provided was superseded within years by more sophisticated weapons designs. The geopolitical context that gave his espionage its significance ended in 1991 with the Soviet Union's collapse, but the human consequences persist. Michael and Robert Mirapol are still alive, still dealing with the fact that their parents were executed, still trying to understand what responsibility different people bore for what happened to their family, Stephen Greenglass lived his entire life as the son of a convicted spy who testified against his own sister. Ruth Greenglass died knowing she had helped send her sister-in-law to the electric chair. These are the costs that do not appear in strategic assessments or historical timelines, but that define what espionage actually means in human terms, not just the transfer of classified information, but the destruction of families, the creation of orphans, the burden of guilt carried across decades, and the impossibility of undoing or adequately atoning for choices made in youth that reverberate through entire lifetimes.